Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a stimulating few days, and I'm sure it will continue that way. But I don't know if you're hearing what I'm hearing. Some hope, glimmers of hope, islands of hope in a sea of, if not despair and depression, at least a bit of a bad mood. And that is the starting point of this session as well, the decline of organized liberalism in Europe right now, if not the ideas of liberalism in Europe right now. If there is a light at the end of the tunnel, we sometimes get the impression that it's an approaching train that we're about to crash with. One interpretation is that people just don't like liberal ideas. But another, quite contrary interpretation is that all the other parties and movements have reluctantly and after a long time come around to accepting some of the most important aspects of liberalism. So, which is it? Are we conquering and succeeding ourselves to death, or is it that the liberal ideas as such are in a moment of crisis? Well, since we are all a little bit depressed, I think it's my role here should be to try to give us some perspective on the issue of whether we are winning or losing. Is liberalism in decline or even in a crisis? Well, when we look around in Europe and in the industrialized world and in North America, I think it's easy to despair right now when we see the demands, often popular demands, for more of government intrusion, surveillance, giving up personal liberties, hostility to immigrants and minority groups, fences and tariffs, and more bailouts and more government intervention in the economy. We have new, strong populist and outspoken anti-liberal movements and parties on the march. Sometimes, often protectionist, sometimes racist, and at some points also outright anti-democratic. It's easy to think that the work we are doing in various liberal parties and movements, they don't have any effect. But when I'm sometimes tempted to despair about those efforts, all that hard work, the attempts to come up with the new ideas, new versions, applying them in new ways and trying to get a popular appeal, when I'm tempted to despair about the success, I often think about a point made by the British author Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh, being a staunch, practicing Catholic, behaved in often ruthless and self-destructive ways. And a friend of his pointed out at one point, "How can you be so nasty despite your faith?" And he responded, "Oh, you have no idea how much nastier I would be if I was not a Catholic." And it sounds like a bit of an excuse, right? But I also think that there's some truth to that in many in our day and age. And let me spell out the obvious parallel to our situation. You have no idea how much nastier Europe would be right now if it weren't for the work of liberals and liberal parties around the continent, if they did not constantly fight for freedom. And just a case in point, think of all the dogs that didn't bark after this tremendous financial crisis, the biggest one of our era. We knew what happened the last time in the 30s. We could have expected some of that happening in the years we've just seen. An unraveling of the European Union, of the internal market, blocks to the freedom of movement, attacks, political and physical attacks on scapegoats like minority groups, like immigrants. Would young democracies even survive the strain on them after this crisis? So far, we haven't seen the nastiest expressions of that. It's too early to sigh relief, and we do see some ugly tendencies like that. But so far, it hasn't really happened in that way. And that was not a done deal. It was not something we could take for granted. You might say that so far we got through this just by the skin of our teeth. But that's the way it always is. We always make it just by the skin of our teeth. But we always make it as long as there are principled defenders of freedom around the continent. And let's not lose sight of what is happening around the world. Because globally, liberal ideas are winning. Globally, freedom is on the march. More than 20 years ago, Milton Friedman, the economist, wanted to end a speech on a positive note in a dramatic era. He said that he had read a newspaper article that was 200 years old. And in that newspaper article, the newspaper pointed out that in that day and age, slaves outnumbered free men in the world 23-1. People who lived in slavery, in feudal serfdom, or in authoritarian dictatorships outnumbered free people 23-1. But when Milton Friedman spoke a bit more than 20 years ago, that ratio had fallen to 3-1, according to the Freedom House statistics on the number of free countries around the world and the number of authoritarian countries. And he pointed out, we are still very far from the goal of a completely free world. But on the scale of historic time, that is amazing progress, more in the past 2 centuries than the prior 2 millennia. End of quote. And you know what? Since he spoke, that ratio has fallen again, from 3-1 to 1-1, when we look at the attempts to measure democracy, personal freedom, freedom of speech, rule of law, and so on. Despite what goes on in the big authoritarian governments, in dictatorships, despite China, despite Russia, we've seen more progress in 2 decades than in the 2 millennia before that. And that is a remarkable achievement. And we can see the same thing when it comes to economic freedom. Attempts to measure economic freedom around the world and put a number on that sometimes vague concept shows that since 1980, the world average has moved on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 meaning complete economic freedom. We moved from 5.3 to 6.9. If the world of 1980 appeared in our world today, it would have been the 144th most economically free country out of 152 measured countries. That's the progress that has been made. The world average of 1980 would be where Venezuela and Zimbabwe are today. And as people liberate themselves, they also liberate themselves from poverty. For some reason, this is rarely in the news or in the cover stories, but we are witnessing the fastest improvement of social and economic standards that the world has ever seen. The latest data from the World Bank pointed out that in 1 year, extreme poverty was reduced by 115 million people. 115 million people in 1 year. That means that 220 people were lifted out of poverty every minute of every day, around the clock. Every minute. And that's just the peak of a long trend. In the last 30 years, extreme poverty has been reduced from 53% to 17% of the world population. 1 billion people fewer live in extreme poverty today, despite the fact that world population has increased by 2.5 billion people. That is amazing, and it's relevant to everything that we are talking about, because it's the countries that have made the most use of ideas about freedom and liberalism that has witnessed the most progress. Sometimes it's said that no, it happens in dictatorships, it happens in state capitalist authoritarian governments, and that's true. But why is it happening there? When does it happen there, and in which areas of their societies and in those economies? It happens where people get some degree of freedom. Even in China, we've seen recent book by economists like Roland Coase and Nicholas Lardy, who points out that it's not because of state capitalism, it's not because of authoritarianism, it's because of all those areas where people have been allowed to get some degree of freedom. It started with grassroots revolutions. It didn't start with a command from Deng Xiaoping. It started with poor farmer families who began to privatize their land in secret and promised themselves that let's not talk to anyone else, and if anyone gets a notice of what we're doing here, then we'll have a sacred vow that we will bring up the children of those who end up in labor camps, because that is what would have happened some 30 years ago in China. But then when they began to privatize their land in secret, and they could see that this was a way to create incredible productivity growth, then the Communist Party set their seal of approval. on this. It began with that grassroots revolution of poor farmers, of villagers who began to demand the right to start their own businesses. It began with private businesses demanding the right to set their own prices and so on. Yes, they can still drag around a lot of authoritarian state capitalism and corruption and state authoritarianism. But China is now flourishing despite that, not because of that. Now we can see it with the private businesses that were responsible for a third of Chinese exports in 1995, now for almost 90% of China's exports. India, another huge country that has begun to reform itself in the last 20 years. I've just concluded a documentary show on India's social and economic progress. And one of the people I talked to is an Indian liberal, Gucharan Das, who talks about what has happened in India in the last few years. 250 million people have raised themselves out of poverty after those reforms began. And he points this out, and I quote, "Here is a nation that is rising on the basis of the principles of political and economic liberty that liberated the West. And this is happening at a time when the West is agonizing over its own system of liberalism and capitalism. I think that it is reassuring that the principles that gave rise, that brought so much prosperity and freedom to the West, are now being affirmed in the East. That is what is going on in the world today. And so the rise of India is not only good for the 1.2 billion Indians, it is also good for the world. And the West should relearn those lessons that India is learning today." End of quote. And just think of the size of that transformation. What was the Industrial Revolution about? It was about some 200 million people doubling their income in some 50 years. And that was the biggest economic transformation the world had ever seen. Now it's not 200 million, it's 2 billion people. And it's not in 50 years, it's happening in 10 years. So 10 times more people in 5 times at speed that's 5 times faster. 10.5 is 50. In a way, globalization is 50 times bigger in its impact on human living standards than the Industrial Revolution. What we are witnessing while we are worrying about the state of the world and of Europe is liberal ideas improving the world faster than at any point in history. So why don't people like us? Why is it that liberalism is sometimes a dirty word? Why is it that people don't vote for liberal parties? We think we're so clever, and apparently everything good that we have is the result of liberals, right? Well, perhaps it's that attitude, of that smirk that we sometimes have on our faces. I argue very well, comedian Dave Barry once put it. Ask any of my remaining friends. I can win an argument on any topic, against any opponent. People know this, and therefore they steer clear of me at parties. Often, as a sign of their great respect, they don't even invite me to their parties. End of quote. And it could also be that others take the best of our ideas and they have proven their worth. That in a way we've succeeded and then someone else used those ideas. Is that a problem? Why do liberal parties exist? If we get closer to a liberal world without liberals in power, isn't that a good thing? After all, we should be the ones who are interested more in the power of ideas than in the positions of power. We should realize, I think, that even though the parliaments of Europe sometimes are becoming less liberal and individualistic, the culture we are living in is being liberalized and individualized right now. And I think that this digitalized, globalized era should be our era. Why is that? Because of the revolution in communications technologies and in transport technologies and in personal freedoms, it is now easier than it has ever been for people to get things done, to find partners, associates, friends, customers, to build and create. At the same time, it's more difficult than ever to reach a consensus on what to create. So in other words, it's easier for people to do things from the bottom up than it has ever been before, to solve problems, to create a new world. But it's also more difficult to create top-down systems that fit everybody, because we are now more individualistic than we've ever been. Right now in the economy, we can see the huge shift to small-scale personalization, customization, where hackers and makers are creating new business models, new technologies constantly. With 3D printers, we can now have a factory of our own, which I'm sure would have stunned Karl Marx, that we now have access to productive forces like that. The big companies must behave like small ones in order to survive. It used to be that the Fords of our world could say, yes, you can have any color you like on your car, as long as it's black. Today, the giants like Toyota, they sold some 10 million cars last year. And those 10 million cars, of those 10 million cars, there were 2.5 million different versions of that car, because of smarter robots, because of simpler supply chains, and so on. On Facebook, well, it used to be that you could describe your gender in 2 ways. On Facebook, the English version of Facebook, you can now describe your gender in 51 different ways, from agender to transfeminine to two-spirit. This is the era of small-scale, bottom-up individualism, and therefore it should be the era of liberalism. People surprise us with new forms of media, new business models, new innovations everywhere. And that is also the problem sometimes for our ideas, for those breakthroughs, because everything that's new is also a bit disconcerting, strange, dangerous. It threatens old habits, it threatens old interest groups. We can see that Uber solutions threaten taxi companies, how telemedicine is threatening old ways of financing and accessing healthcare. New learning threatens old teaching establishment. Massive open online courses threatens universities. Crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending threatens banks, and new business models threatens big business and big labor. And as you know, some people are so conservative that they don't want us to try anything for the first time. And that's where I see the role of liberalism in the 21st century, to be the pressure group for the future, for those who do not have a pressure group because they're not there anymore. The new solutions, the new grassroots attempts to create and build something new that's not even there, so that it hasn't so far been put to the test for a long enough time that they prove their worth. Thus, it has been that way forever when it comes to all the technologies, all the solutions that we live with and take for granted all the time. They were always controversial. They only succeeded because they were allowed some breathing space when they could prove their worth to the world. From surgery to credit cards, from contraceptives to the limited stock company, railways, electricity, free speech, they're only there because they were given some time. Today, everybody thinks that the internet is the best thing. But when you read what people thought of the World Wide Web in the early 1990s, you could see that it was extremely controversial. The American leading conservative magazine even had a cover story of a sledgehammer smashing a computer with the title "Smash the Internet" in 1995, because it was supposedly only a breeding ground for neo-Nazis and for perverts. The biggest Swedish left-leaning arts page had a huge cover story called "Internet Makes Life Worse for Most People." And even famous economists like Paul Krugman put it like this: the growth of the internet will soon slow drastically. It's overhyped, because most people have nothing to say to each other. By 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machine. End of quote. And I think that if we had had an up or down vote, should we devote resources to the internet? Should we even allow people such wild freedom of speech at that time, when it hadn't been allowed to put itself to the test? I think most people could have said no, and we wouldn't have internet in our day and age. And this is the role of the liberal, I think, to fight the 3 shades of conservatism. The blue conservatives who oppose cultural change, the changes that are taking place in family structures, in habits, in homogeneity, ethnic and religious homogeneity. The red conservatives who oppose economic change, and the green conservatives who oppose technological change. All those who are nostalgic for a golden age when people dwelt in ease and peace upon the lands with many good things, unlike now when we're just rushing around and we can't make our minds up. As the Greek poet Hesiod put it in the 8th century before Christ. They all know what the world should look like, but we are not as smart as them, or at least we know our limitations. Because we have read Karl Popper, we have read Hayek, and we know that every time we centralize decisions, when we make regulations, rules, commands, we replace the opinions and experiments of millions and billions of people with the ideas and commands of just a few people in leading positions. So we lose experiments and we lose knowledge. Sometimes we need that. Sometimes we have to make up our mind on which side of the road we all should be driving. Then we need centralized decisions. But most decisions aren't like that. Most innovations just seem strange because they threaten old habits, old pressure groups, and I think it's our duty to fight against that. Oftentimes it's said that liberalism has no values. It's a kind of a nihilistic creed because anything goes. No idea of human nature, no particular version of mankind that we'd like to see. But oh yes, there is. We like a version of mankind that can still surprise us, who know more than we do and come up with solutions that we would never have thought about. So in my mind, the liberal, in a way, is a firefighter. When public opinion or special interest groups or the government turn on and are provoked by and oppose the innovations or minority groups or the creative destruction that keeps the economy going, we should rush to their defense and pour some cold water on that anxiety, on that fear, on that hostility, so that people think it through before they start with intolerance and blockages to that new development, so that people are given a chance to prove the value of what they are doing. Too often it seems like we are the establishment. I think we are, or should be, the opposite. Those who embrace change from below and defend it long enough to prove their worth. And that is sometimes a minority opinion. It has to be a minority opinion, because oftentimes the majority is opposed to that change. Perhaps it's not fitted to be a broad mass movement. But we don't have to be the majority. We can be the handmaidens of the future. We can protect the new bizarre ideas, the surgery technologies and the World Wide Web of tomorrow, the handmaidens of the future, so that later, when the majority has shifted opinion on this, the other parties, other people will also shift, and they will start to talk of it as part of their heritage and take credit for it. And I think that if we exist only to make others more liberal, we should be happy. And when they take credit for what has happened, we will always know that we were there and we made the future happen. And that is quite an achievement. Thank you.